Today is April 30th, 2026. Everybody is focused on Tehran. Everybody is watching the IRGC, the sweeping maritime blockade, the crumbling nuclear negotiations. But the most strategically devastating blow of this entire conflict is quietly detonating thousands of miles away, inside a nation that has not fired a single shot, nor had a single bomb fall on its territory. That country is China. What we are witnessing across the heavily militarized waters of the Middle East is not just a regional containment strategy. It is the real-time, mathematical implosion of a decade-long silent empire. Xi Jinping built an entire global power architecture around Iranian energy and infrastructure. Now, without dropping a single munition on Chinese soil, the United States has completely demolished it. The Hormuz blockade is actively strangling Chinese megafactories. The $400 billion strategic partnership has evaporated. Xi Jinping's vaunted fortress economy is cracking from the inside out. To understand the terminal failure of Beijing's current position, you must dissect the anatomy of the 2021 China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Valued at $400 billion, this was engineered to secure Iranian energy and infrastructure for a full quarter century. Naval intelligence assessments confirm this was never a standard diplomatic treaty. It was the absolute spine of Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative's westward expansion, designed to permanently bridge the Central Asia and West Asia economic corridors. Chinese state-backed entities systematically colonized Iran's industrial base. The China National Petroleum Corporation entrenched itself at the South Pars gas field. Huawei hardwired the nation's telecommunications grid. Beijing poured capital into the Chabahar and Jask ports, specifically architecting exclusive oil export routes designed to completely bypass the strategic vulnerability of the Strait of Hormuz. China was quietly absorbing roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports, providing a critical financial lifeline to Tehran. It was a ruthlessly efficient resource extraction arrangement disguised as geopolitical friendship. This extraction pipeline relied entirely on a phantom armada. Iran's shadow fleet operated as a continuous conveyor belt of discounted crude, shielding Beijing from global market volatility. To bypass international oversight, this network perfected the dark arts of maritime logistics, deploying false flags, running spoof transponders, and conducting illicit ship-to-ship transfers in the murky waters off the coast of Malaysia. The mathematics of this deception, cross-referenced by the Financial Times, are staggering. Official Chinese customs records show absolute zero imports from Iran since 2022. Yet, Beijing's recorded Malaysian crude imports in 2024 miraculously reached 1.3 million barrels per day. That volume is more than double Malaysia's entire domestic oil production. It is a 1.3 million barrel daily lie. If you require this level of unvarnished, deep-spectrum geopolitical intelligence, the kind of raw strategic analysis that strips away the noise and exposes the actual mechanics of global power, hit that subscribe button right now. We are tracking the quiet collapse of these global architectures every single day, and you cannot afford to navigate this shifting world blind. Now, that covert energy bridge has been systematically obliterated. When United States and Israeli strikes began to pummel Iranian targets starting on February 28, 2026, the entire extraction chain shattered. Washington is not simply blockading Iranian ports. Naval intelligence confirms they are aggressively hunting the very shadow network that kept China's cheap energy flowing. On April 19th, American forces intercepted and seized the sanctioned Iranian container ship MV Tuska in the Gulf of Oman. It was on a return voyage from China, reportedly loaded with sensitive dual-use equipment. The American naval blockade is executing a flawless strangulation of the Dark Fleet. 34 vessels were decisively turned back by U.S. destroyers. The cheap Iranian oil pipeline has run completely dry. And how did the architect of this $400 billion global node react when its flagship partner was facing existential military decapitation? Did Beijing deploy naval assets? Did they leverage their massive economic weight? No. China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun stepped to a podium and offered efforts to restore peace. Efforts, a pathetic, hollow press statement. The friendship vanished the precise second the extraction chain broke. But as the smoke clears over the Gulf, the true horror for Beijing is just beginning to materialize. Because the collateral damage of this maritime strangulation isn't confined to the Middle East. It is currently bleeding directly into the Chinese mainland, and the panic inside Xi Jinping's inner circle is becoming impossible to hide. We must pull back the curtain on the Chinese domestic theater, where the narrative of a seamless pivot to Russian crude is being violently dismantled by cold, hard mathematics. Financial Times market analysts have scrutinized the supply vectors, and the reality is stark. China currently has at least 5.4 million barrels of oil per day trapped behind the Strait of Hormuz blockade. In a desperate bid to offset this massive hemorrhage, Beijing absorbed an additional 300,000 barrels per day from Russia in January and February, bringing the total Russian influx to approximately 2.1 million barrels per day. The gulf between those two figures is a mathematical impossibility. The persistent geopolitical myth that Xi Jinping can simply dial up Moscow to replace Middle Eastern crude ignores the fundamental physical limits of infrastructure. Russia fundamentally lacks the requisite pipeline capacity. Russia lacks the shadow tanker fleet. Furthermore, Russian seaborne crude must transit through global maritime straits that the United States Navy possesses the undisputed capability to interdict at a moment's notice. Beijing did aggressively stockpile 1 billion barrels in its strategic petroleum reserves, a volume theoretically sufficient for roughly 120 days. But naval intelligence doctrines dictate that stockpiles are never a strategy. They are simply borrowed time. And for the Chinese industrial engine, that borrowed time is evaporating at a terrifying velocity. Step off the geopolitical chessboard and look down at the factory floors of the mainland, where the fortress economy is enduring a synchronized systemic failure. The economic data bleeding out of China in April 2026 reveals a domestic catastrophe that state-run media is desperately attempting to suppress. Across the first 2 weeks of April, Chinese automotive plants produced 27% fewer vehicles compared to the same timeframe last year. This is not a peripheral sector. The automotive industry, explicitly driving the electric vehicle and next-generation manufacturing transition, is the absolute bedrock of China's future economic model. According to Alicia Garcia Herrero, the chief economist for Asia-Pacific at Natixis, this severe deceleration threatens to drag China below its already depressed annual growth target of 4.5%. That figure represents the lowest projected economic baseline since the early 1990s. The entire ecosystem of electric vehicles, advanced semiconductors, and hyperscaled manufacturing relies heavily on chemical and energy inputs that are either entirely choked off by the Hormuz blockade or rendered financially toxic by the radiating energy shock. This macroeconomic asphyxiation is manifesting in raw, localized social instability. Consider the events of late April, an anomaly in the heavily surveilled Chinese state that signals a profound structural fracture. In the southern manufacturing hub of Yulin, thousands of workers orchestrated a mass protest following the abrupt and complete shutdown of multiple factories on April 20th. The catalyst was not domestic policy, but a violent surge in global plastic prices directly triggered by the severed maritime logistics in the Strait of Hormuz. Desperate laborers draped banners across locked factory gates demanding, "Return my blood and sweat money," while state police passively monitored the volatile scene. In a totalitarian system where public demonstration carries severe personal risk, this level of mobilized fury indicates that the economic pain at the ground level has breached critical thresholds. These facilities did not go dark because of abstract geopolitical posturing. They collapsed because their profit margins were instantly vaporized by a supply chain shock originating 5,000 miles away. The global ripple effects are compounding Beijing's industrial misery. Half of the entire planet's seaborne trade in sulfur, a non-negotiable input for heavy industrial processing, flows directly through the Strait of Hormuz. The sudden paralysis of petrochemical complexes and the resulting fertilizer shortages are actively triggering global food price inflation. Simultaneously, critical disruptions to aluminum Bahrain and Emirates Global Aluminium have ignited a severe deficit in automotive-grade aluminum, crippling the supply lines of global giants like Toyota, Nissan, BMW, and Hyundai. But China suffers the brunt of this global commodity starvation. The Chinese manufacturing leviathan sits at the absolute epicenter of these shattered supply chains. They desperately require that aluminum for their electric vehicle rollout. They need that sulfur for massive industrial processing. They are starved of the petrochemical inputs necessary for the plastics that encase everything from consumer electronics to global packaging. The Hormuz blockade has fundamentally destroyed China's manufacturing cost base, neutralizing the single competitive advantage upon which Xi Jinping's entire economic paradigm relies. But the most chilling escalation of this economic warfare arrived in April 2026, when Washington executed a precision financial strike that bypassed the Middle East entirely. The United States directly sanctioned the Hengyi Petrochemical Dalian refinery, one of China's largest independent teapot refineries, explicitly for the processing of illicit Iranian crude. This was not a diplomatic warning shot. This was the United States demonstrating in blindingly clear terms that they have mapped the entire anatomy of Beijing's dark fleet. They know precisely which domestic facilities are refining the smuggled oil. And most terrifyingly, they are perfectly willing and actively capable of reaching directly into China's sovereign industrial infrastructure to apply terminal economic pressure. The fortress has been breached, but the structural damage inflicted upon the mainland is merely a symptom of a much larger, catastrophic geopolitical realignment that is rewriting the global order in real time. To fully grasp the magnitude of what the United States just accomplished, we must elevate our analysis above the immediate industrial hemorrhage and examine the smoldering wreckage of China's grand global design. What died in the waters of the Middle East was not merely a localized energy conduit. It was the foundational logic of the Belt and Road Initiative itself. Chatham House frameworks define true geopolitical leverage as the ability to project both economic connectivity and credible security guarantees. For nearly 2 decades, Beijing aggressively marketed a very specific, alluring proposition to the developing world. China is the ultimate, stable alternative to the West, a partner that can deliver massive infrastructure capital without the restrictive political strings or the moralizing oversight demanded by Washington. This was the brand. This was the pitch that secured over $269 billion in committed infrastructure investments across the Middle East since 2005. They built sprawling automated ports, laid thousands of miles of vital pipelines, constructed multi-lane highways, and engineered massive power generation plants. But the fundamental assumption undergirding this entire architecture was that Beijing possessed the strength and the will to defend it. The Iran war just violently disproved that assumption on the global stage. The strategic consequence of the United States intervention is the complete and irreversible collapse of core Belt and Road assumptions. It has brutally demonstrated to every participating nation that sprawling physical infrastructure remains acutely vulnerable to kinetic military escalation, and that the illusion of political neutrality is impossible to maintain when great power conflicts ignite. Iran was not a peripheral node in this network. It was the absolute flagship. It was the strategically critical anchor of Xi Jinping's entire westward expansion strategy. Yet, when Tehran faced total systemic decapitation beginning on February 28th, the architect of this $400 billion alliance stood paralyzed. Beijing's inaction was a defining moment of strategic cowardice that reverberated through every capital aligned with the Belt and Road. When the United Arab Emirates, recognizing the existential threat to global maritime trade, proactively joined a United States-led naval alliance and publicly demanded the immediate reopening of the critical straits, Beijing remained terrifyingly silent. They offered no resistance to the weaponization of the world's most vital energy artery. The Gulf monarchies, traditionally cautious in their alliances, have now witnessed precisely what Chinese security cooperation looks like when Iranian volatility threatens their sovereign territory. The damage to China's geopolitical credibility is profound and deepening by the hour. Every single nation that signed a Belt and Road Memorandum is currently reassessing their vulnerability. From the strategic corridors of Pakistan to the sprawling archipelagos of Indonesia and deep into the heart of Central Asia, governments that trusted China's explicit promise of unwavering economic connectivity are watching a brutal reality unfold. They are watching Beijing quietly stand by as its most vital partner is systematically dismantled. In Riyadh, in Jakarta, in Islamabad, and in Nairobi, the most dangerous question in modern geopolitics is being asked loudly. Is the People's Republic of China a reliable strategic partner capable of projecting global stability, or are they merely a transactional buyer of cheap, distressed resources that will cut and run at the first sign of American naval pressure? Naval intelligence and diplomatic cables suggest that this question, once injected into the global discourse, cannot simply be bought off with another round of heavily subsidized infrastructure loans. The trust architecture that held the entire sprawling apparatus of the Belt and Road together has suffered terminal structural damage. The psychological shift among these pivotal nations is a strategic victory for Washington that will outlast the kinetic phase of this war by decades. The developing world has recognized that a Chinese port or a Chinese pipeline offers absolutely zero protection when the United States decides to enforce a maritime interdiction. Xi Jinping's fortress economy is therefore cracking on two distinct fronts. From the immediate agonizing physical strangulation of the Hormuz blockade, and from the catastrophic collapse of the geopolitical trust that sustained its global expansion. This localized conflict has exposed a horrifying reality for the Chinese Communist Party. They have spent billions building a global empire of infrastructure, only to realize that they completely lack the power projection capabilities required to defend it from American intervention. And as the geopolitical fallout settles across the Middle East and Asia, this structural vulnerability leads directly to the single geographical trap that has haunted Chinese defense planners since the early 2000s. A vulnerability that Washington just proved it can exploit with devastating precision. Enter the ultimate strategic nightmare. The dimension of this conflict that Beijing finds most genuinely terrifying is not the immediate economic hemorrhage, because stockpiles can theoretically be burned through and alternative suppliers eventually secured at exorbitant premiums. What the Chinese Politburo cannot manage is the chilling tactical lesson the United States Navy just taught the entire world by closing the Strait of Hormuz. Every admiral and strategic planner sitting in Beijing has spent the last 6 weeks paralyzed by a single geographic reality, first identified as a critical vulnerability by former Chinese President Hu Jintao in 2003, Malacca. Naval intelligence heavily monitors this specific choke point for a reason. The Strait of Malacca, a heavily trafficked maritime artery wedged between Sumatra Island in Indonesia and peninsular Malaysia, accommodates over 60,000 vessels annually. It facilitates approximately 25% of all global maritime trade. Crucially, it is the sole conduit for roughly 80% of China's imported crude oil. 80% of the energy required to run the world's manufacturing engine must pass through a single, highly vulnerable waterway that narrows to a mere 3 kilometers wide near Singapore. And the United States military has completely fortified both ends of this geographic cage. The entire architecture of American naval power projection in the Indo-Pacific, from the deep water facilities at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean to strategic outposts in Singapore, Japan, and Guam, is explicitly built around the absolute capability to pressure and close that strait. The Hormuz blockade was not merely about containing Iran. It was a live-fire proof of concept. The United States just demonstrated with active naval assets that it can cleanly seal a strategic choke point against a highly militarized regime while simultaneously keeping global trade flowing for everyone else. Washington proved it can manage oil price volatility for its own allies while maintaining absolute deniability that it is actively targeting any specific sovereign nation's trade. It is the cleanest, most precise economic weapon ever deployed in modern warfare, and Beijing just watched the entire execution from the front row. Chinese academics are now openly panicking. Jin Guo, a research fellow specializing in security at East China University, argued in the South China Morning Post that Washington's campaign reflects an intensified focus on a global maritime blockade strategy designed specifically to stifle Beijing's development, terming it an unchangeable reality. The panic is compounding regionally. Indonesia's finance minister recently sent shockwaves through global shipping insurance markets by openly floating the idea of mimicking Iran's transit taxes on ships sailing through Malacca, brutally reminding the world that Indonesia sits atop a highly strategic trade route. The Hudson Institute assessment is blunt. Washington won the Hormuz battle, and the chessboard is actively moving east. Beijing is desperately attempting to mitigate this dilemma by aggressively transitioning to electric vehicles to diminish transportation fuel demand, but that generational strategy offers zero protection today. In the event of a kinetic conflict over Taiwan, United States interdiction of Chinese oil shipments through Malacca is no longer a theoretical wargame scenario. It is a fully proven operational capability. If China moves on Taiwan, the question is no longer whether the United States could execute a blockade, but how ruthlessly fast they will turn off the lights in Beijing. We are now staring down a terminal countdown. Financial Times tracking models indicate Beijing possesses a maximum of 60 to 90 days before domestic refiners must systematically halt production runs. The strategic desperation is palpable. Xi Jinping recently pleaded with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman that the Strait of Hormuz should remain open, a humiliating admission from a supposed superpower asking for relief rather than enforcing it. To mask this profound structural weakness, Beijing is aggressively flexing where it still holds an asymmetric advantage, moving to blockade the Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea. They are attempting to project strength through a hollow four-point peace initiative, desperate to play the mediator and recover geopolitical prestige. Let us be clear, China is not fundamentally broken by this specific crisis. Goldman Sachs still projects a managed 4.8% growth rate, and Beijing is too disciplined to execute a reckless military escalation. But the geopolitical damage is structural, permanent, and utterly devastating. The myth of the impenetrable fortress economy has violently collided with mathematical reality. Xi Jinping presides over a massive industrial base with terminally exposed supply lines, facing an American adversary that has mapped every single vulnerability. This is the new, unforgiving reality of modern economic warfare. I want to hear your geopolitical assessment in the comments. Is China's economy far more vulnerable than Beijing has projected, or can they engineer a way out of this strategic cage?